Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to talk about this, a PTR-9CT chambered in 9mm. This is our latest in the Friendly Fire series, the series where I review guns out of my friends' collections so that we can remove my purchase bias and discuss at the end whether or not I would buy it and what changes I would make. Now, before we get into this video, we do need to go ahead and cover a couple of caveats. So, first off, this is not a submachine gun. It is not produced by Heckler & Koch. This is a semi-automatic pistol. However, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about are going to cover the development by Heckler & Koch, or at least some of the background with Heckler & Koch, as well as other licensed manufacturers that kind of get wrapped up in this conversation. Keep in mind that the biggest thing to take away from this is at the end of the day, we are assessing this product. We are assessing this configuration. This is what I'm going to make all of my recommendations and all of my considerations off of. Not the submachine gun, not an SBR, none of those types of things. And on the subject of SBR, we get into our second caveat here, which is, for this very moment, as of the filming of this video, this is referred to as a pistol, as a braced pistol, or what I refer to as a 3 points of contact pistol. The ATF right now does have a letter out and is about to solidify their position that all of these pistols with braces on them are now SBRs. However, that effective date has not begun. All of the stuff that's supposed to happen once that effective date is initiated has not yet begun. So for the moment, this is a legal pistol. And that is the next part, that's the next aspect of this that is going to be covered in this video. We are going to discuss this as a pistol in the present legal configuration, not taking into account the upcoming change in determination. I don't know when it'll be. Could be a week, could be a month, could be longer, who knows. But for the moment, we're going to talk about this in what our last guidance from the ATF was, as opposed to the 3 previous determinations they came up with. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into background. In 1966, Heckler & Koch came out with the MP5 submachine gun, which was indicative of a Generation 3 submachine gun involving stamped metal receivers, plastic furniture, and closed bolt firing systems. Now, we'll discuss more about the bolt and the firing system and all that kind of stuff once we get to our features. I don't necessarily want to dwell on it right now. Now, this submachine gun would become a runaway success with military and law enforcement all around the world. However, it would not necessarily pick up a lot of demand in the civilian sector. At this time, when this gun came out, there wasn't a lot of demand for tactical weapons in the wider, or military or police style weapons in the wider shooting community. Those were considered to be passing fancies, toys, and stuff like that. If you were going to defend your freedom, you're going to do it with an M1 carbine or an M1 Garand or something along those lines, as opposed to a pistol caliber carbine that looked kind of space age. Now, Heckler & Koch would bring in a semi-automatic version of the MP5 that was civilian legal, so 16-inch barrel, all that kind of stuff. However, it would run into some issues getting into the 80s with importation bans that were coming out, as well as the 1994 assault weapons ban, which pretty much cured Heckler & Koch of any interest of bringing in long guns of any type, and primarily focusing on handguns. And this would continue all the way through the sunset of the assault weapons ban in 2004. Now, that is a hotly debated subject whenever it comes to Heckler & Koch and their importation into the United States, that they kind of just threw in the towel on trying to deal with American laws on this particular subject. But I think a lot of it has come down to Heckler & Koch has more interest in providing arms to military and law enforcement than they do to the private sector, especially in America. But other licensed manufacturers didn't necessarily share that opinion and sought to be able to take advantage of the demand in the United States for HK-style weapon systems. And that's where you get a lot of these licensed manufacturers who start to import. Zenith being a fantastic example, but a licensed manufacturer stood up in the United States, and that was PTR. Now, they would initially come in with their PTR-91, which was a copy of the G3. You would then also eventually see a PTR-31, if I remember correctly, which was the 7.62x3.9 chambered version of an HK-33. And ultimately, PTR would eventually start coming out with the PTR-9, which is their MP5 clone. And that's one of the big things here. This is a clone of the weapon system, not an actual HK-produced model. Now, HK has started importing the SP5 in order to also hop into this market. However, it is significantly more expensive than these other offerings. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular pistol? Right off the bat, we have an 8.86-inch barrel. And now, on the end of the barrel, we actually have two different muzzle device options. We have a tri-lug, and then we also have a 1/2x28 thread underneath this thread protector right here at the end of the muzzle. And this is what makes this the CT. The PTR-9C just has the tri-lug mount here. And this is pretty fantastic from the standpoint of, if you have a suppressor, you have a couple of different options to be able to mount a 9mm suppressor onto this setup. A lot of guys, once they get suppressors, they want to suppress everything. So a lot of times they'll wind up going to direct thread because that is easier to be able to pass between a bunch of different weapon systems. I'm not a big fan, personally, of direct thread for at least any type of hard duty or hard use in general, but I can understand the utility of having one suppressor that can fit on a lot of different setups. My preference would be to work off of the tri-lug if I was actually to suppress one of these, just because it's a more repeatable and more sustainable mounting system than direct thread. Sometimes direct thread will back off a little bit, and now you're running the risk of baffle strikes on your rather expensive NFA item. Now, as we can see here, our front sight is a hood and post type front sight. We'll talk about that more once we get into the sights here in a little bit. Across the top of the barrel, we have our cocking tube, which houses our charging handle. And we have our little notch back here so that you can conduct your slap. So there's a lot of discussion that stems around this charging handle setup here. First off, there's everyone always addresses whether or not you can lock in a loaded magazine on a closed bolt for this particular weapon system. I can tell you that with a fully loaded magazine, it is quite difficult. Even with a downloaded magazine, it can be kind of difficult to be able to properly lock it into the magazine well on a closed bolt. So that's why the vast majority of the time you'll see the reload procedure involves locking the bolt to the rear, placing in your full magazine, and then releasing the charging handle. Now, the next thing that kind of comes along with that is, should you slap the charging handle or should you pull back and then kind of turn and let it go? In my opinion, slapping is the faster method of doing it, but I can tell you that the pull back and turn method is more sustainable. Sometimes if you don't hit that angle just right on the slap, it doesn't go into battery properly. It doesn't even like release out of its little lock open notch. And keep in mind, guys, this does not have last shot hold open, so this charging handle is very integral to all of the actions that you conduct with this weapon system. So whenever it comes to reloads, what you wind up doing, you fire your rounds, empty that magazine. For me, I bring the charging handle back, rotate it up into its locking notch, shed my empty magazine, secure my new source of feed, lock that into the mag well, and then release the charging handle and get back into the fight. Now, this really becomes problematic whenever you're talking about doing administrative reloads, like you've been shooting for a little bit and you want to go ahead and plus up your weapon to a full magazine again. What you wind up doing is locking the bolt to the rear and ejecting a live round so that you can remove your diminished magazine and replace it with a full one. That's kind of a weird manual of arms. We'll get into that more once we get into my kind of final assessments and some of the shooting aspects of this setup. All right, now, as you guys can see here, we have a aluminum M-lock rail mounted to this weapon system. Now, this being based off the HK pattern and the licensed production thereof, you can get the original kind of rounded handguards, you can get the triangular handguards, and there are also manufacturers out there that produce Picatinny handguards for the setup. Now, Myself, when it comes between M-LOK and Picatinny, I don't really care as long as you have the ability to be able to mount what you need to the weapon system to make it viable to you, which, as we can see here, we have that opportunity. This is a TLR RM1 Light, which is set up with a pressure pad over here on this side, which the owner has this set up, or if I go far forward on the pressure pad, I can get momentary on, but then if I come back further, I get constant on. One of the things to keep in mind here with attaching things to the rail sections on MP5 style weapon systems is that your charging handle is a constant and it's going to be in your way. So it's very difficult to mount anything on this side of the weapon system. So we can see here, the owner has his pressure pad mounted there, and that takes up a lot of space on this really short rail, which means that you run the possibility of accidentally discharging your light when you don't necessarily intend to do so, which given certain tactical situations, a negligent discharge of light can be just as disastrous as a negligent discharge of a firearm. So that's one of my overall issues with pressure pads in general. However, I can say that there is a certain utility to pressure pads and having a more accessible, easier to manage way to be able to activate your light. All right, coming back to our receiver. So you can see here on top we have a welded-on Picatinny rail. The original MP5s would not have this. Optics were kind of an advanced idea for submachine guns at the time. However, this is something that has become more and more common on current production firearms, and especially current production MP5s, because optics are kind of a necessary aspect of fighting in the current realm. Now, as we can see back here, we have our rear sight, which is a drum style rear sight with 4 different apertures. We'll talk about that more once we get to shooting and to my recommendations. Now, these come from the factory zeroed for 25 meters. I can tell you that this thing was pretty much on, but all of your windage and elevation are done off of the rear sight. Now, this is a roller delayed blowback system, which is actually incredibly interesting in a subgun type setup, because you have an actual locked breech. The vast majority of 3 points of contact pistols or PCCs or submachine guns, whatever it is you want to call them, work off of blowback. Now, in the terms of, well, in both open and closed bolt systems, that bolt in a blowback operation is very heavy, and that is so that the bolt is resistant to the pressures that are initially generated during firing, which allows the pressure in the system to drop to a safe enough point for extraction so you don't have out-of-battery detonations and all that kind of stuff. But with that heavy bolt that's supposed to resist the rearward motion, you also wind up with a lot of perceived recoil, which can cause a lot of dot jump and all that kind of stuff and make it more difficult to stay on target and get those faster splits. With a roller delayed blowback system, you have a lighter bolt that is still locked, that is still resisting that rearward motion up until it hits a certain point, which allows you to have a lighter reciprocating mass and really helps keep this thing on target. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting. I'm rolling a picture of what it is that I'm talking about with these rollers that are located on the bolt. I don't want to disassemble this right now. This is actually a really stiff overall build. I don't want to mess with it on camera. All right, on this side we have a sling loop for HK style sling attachment. Now let's go ahead and talk about our controls for a little bit here. We have 2 different ways to be able to release a magazine on this particular weapon system. We have a button type release mounted right here, which can be a little bit difficult to find. You know, I think there's a lot of people out there who can commiserate with that sentiment that the button's hard to find. But we also have a paddle type release underneath. Now, a lot of guns that have been imported over the years in this pattern have not had the paddle type release. That was something that you had to get off of like HK parts or something like that. Pretty much all of them had the button style release. I'm not a big fan of the button release because it is most definitely out of reach of my finger. You pretty much have to do it with your support hand. And it's also kind of small to find. It is not ambidextrous, whereas the paddle release most definitely is. Now, the paddle release suffers from the same issue where it is just out of reach of my finger. I cannot, from a firing grip, release this magazine. So that comes back to the whole lock the bolt to the rear, remove your prior source of feed, secure new source, place it in the weapon system, and then run the charging handle. So at the very least though, with the button release, the magazines do drop free. I do kind of appreciate that. All right, now our safety. This one has a single-sided safety, and again, you need really long fingers in order to be able to actuate it from your firing grip. I can touch it with my thumb, but I can't really get enough of an angle on it to be able to activate the fire selection on this particular weapon system, which is really irritating. Now, I have worked around other guns in the MP5 family, specifically an MP5 SD, and that one had an ambidextrous setup, and I found that very excellent, to where I could ride my thumb on this side, be able to select whatever method of fire that I wanted at the time, and then run the weapon system as I needed and sweep it back up once I was done. So that was something that I really appreciated, and I wish this had. Now, of course, if this was a submachine gun, we would have a selection spot for the giggle switch, but they also made these not just in full auto, but you also had the opportunity to be able to get 2-round and 3-round burst, and semi-auto, 2-round, 3-round, whatever combination of the above that you wanted on your particular weapon system, which I always thought was really neat, especially the 2-round burst. Just seems like, I could imagine a bunch of SWAT guys going through a building, double tapping people in the head with a 2-round burst function on their MP5s. It's just what it always evoked in my mind. Now, what's really interesting is that this weapon system is set up to be able to accept a full auto sear if you have a registered full auto sear, which is pretty cool. Overall, that's not necessarily the case on previous iterations from other importers. Now, our trigger. Let's go ahead and talk about this real quick. Our trigger kind of reminds me of an AK trigger, in which I have some take-up, a little bit of take-up, like a little bit of free travel onto some tension building up into take-up, and then I hit what feels like a wall, and then I just kind of roll through it. And then my reset pretty much puts me right back out onto all that take-up. It doesn't put me straight back to the wall, which is a little bit regrettable. Now, this trigger is smooth, and I do appreciate that. And honestly, guys, this is not some sort of precision rifle setup. This is a PCC, a subgun type weapon system. All this is supposed to really do is engage in relatively close distances for like CQB type stuff. This is a perfectly good trigger for that type of purpose, where you're just hammering targets and all that kind of stuff. You'll have no real issues with this trigger. If you're sitting there trying to get like sub-MOA groups at 100 yards, you're on the wrong weapon system. All right, now our pistol grip kind of rakes back at an angle like a M16 pistol grip. I'm not the biggest fan. I think that kind of plays into why it is so difficult for me to be able to reach the controls on this. If it was a little bit more vertical, perhaps it would be a tad easier. It does have an opening in the bottom, so that if you wanted to, you could put like spare batteries or something like that wrapped up inside of like a baggie of some sort and stuffed in there to take up some space if you needed replacements for like your light or something along those lines. In the rear here, we have QD cups, which are appreciated so that you could finish off your sling type setup. As we can see here, we have a telescoping style PDW brace, which has 3 positions: all the way out, all the way closed, and then a mid position. Now, this would be indicative of an MP5 A3, if I remember correctly. It might be an A2. I'll annotate down. I'll roll in a picture of which one it is that I'm talking about and annotate below on that. You can get these with side folding braces, with more skeletonized braces, as well as if you wanted to, you could SBR this and throw a telescoping stock or a solid stock or a side folding stock, whatever it is that you want to get. There's a lot of options available for different type of, extendable points of contact on this weapon system. And I'm not the biggest fan of braces overall, because there's not a lot of usable surface area. Like, some people consider these to be some sort of like go around on the NFA, because, well, it's like having a stock, but it's legally not considered a stock. You're supposed to run your forearm through here so that you can shoot the weapon system one-handed and all that kind of stuff. However, I don't consider, like, these are malleable. They're made of rubber and they've got these straps and all that kind of stuff. You have to put it fairly high up on your, get this portion deep into your shoulder, which causes your head to be a little bit higher in the weapon system. It kind of throws you off some. It's not terribly comfortable. So I don't consider these to be effective replacements of a stock. And like, if I wanted to use this serious as an SBR, and it's getting a little bit ahead of myself right now, but if I want to get serious with this weapon system, I would SBR this and I would get an actual stable shooting platform off of this weapon system. That's just me. They work in a pinch. They're just not as great as everyone makes them out to be. All right, guys. Ooh, before we get done, magazines. These would be produced with 10, 20, and 30 round magazines. You can find them in both steel and polymer, and you can find them straight and curved like this one here. The original HKs were produced in 40 Smith & Wesson and 10 millimeter in addition to 9 millimeter, which anyone who's read Rainbow Six knows that. However, the most common is the 9 millimeter, though I think that one of these in a 40 Smith & Wesson would be really interesting, let alone the 10 mil, of course. You're talking about this barrel length combined with those cartridges getting a little bit higher velocities than you would get out of a normal handgun. That's pretty cool. That's a very interesting idea. All right, guys, so with that, how does it shoot?
I call this one. Yeah, it looks like it.
This thing is an absolute blast to shoot. However, there are a couple of caveats to go along with that. Now, first off, recoil impulse and all that kind of stuff, it's very light. It's very easy to keep this weapon system on target. And especially having had some experience with this family in full auto, it's like cheating. It's not even fair how easy it is to control them as opposed to AR-9s where you've got all that reciprocating mass. Though they're very easy to handle, it's still more recoil than what you find on this. Like the level of cheating that this weapon system constitutes in the form of shooting is ridiculous. However, when it comes down to manual of arms, having to operate around this charging handle and all that kind of stuff, this thing's kind of a pain. So here most recently, I set up some one reload ones, and I ran into a lot of issue trying to do it in the traditional manner, specifically with locking in my loaded magazine on a closed bolt.
I lost count.
Yeah, with the camera, it's pretty easy. Once you hit it, you just aim at that same spot. It's easy to sight it, easier to sight it in.
It was really causing me a lot of issues, and it was really starting to kind of drive me mad. In addition to the fact that the feed lips on these magazines are not very strong. So as I was going through the process of changing mags and stuff like that, I don't know if it was a matter of me mashing these in on a closed bolt or if they'd just been dropped one too many times or what the deal is, but I had one magazine that became very finicky in the process of going through these drills. So that is something that's very important to keep an eye on, and maybe this is a situation where you have to put magazines in your back pocket or in a dump pouch of some sort instead of just dropping them on the ground if you want to be able to keep using them. I dislike that because I need plug-and-play systems that don't require additional thought. When you consider that I already have to be beholden to this bolt to begin with, I am not happy with any additional manipulations or handlings that have to be incorporated with this weapon system. Now, accuracy-wise, I'm not really big on measuring the accuracy of pistols and all that kind of stuff, but I can tell you that it was more than good out to, like, I think 50 yards was the furthest I pushed this out to, and I had no problem hitting a 4-inch steel at that distance. So this weapon system will do exactly what it is that it needs to do. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations? And keep in mind, once again, we're talking about in this configuration, that we see here, what are my recommendations? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Well, the MP5 submachine gun has served faithfully in duty type roles for decades now. Would I recommend this PTR pistol for duty type use? Probably not, if I'm being completely honest. And it comes down to three things. First off, the brace. Now, the brace has its own type of utility if you're some type of professional who has to cross state borders a lot. At the very least, you don't have to worry about NFA type things. You just have to worry about the transport of pistols as you go through different states, because that's how this falls in legally for the moment. So with that being the case, if you do a lot of traveling, then this may be advantageous to you. If you don't do a lot of traveling and you want to use one of these seriously, I would sooner see you turn this into an SBR as opposed to continue to try to utilize it as a pistol just to get that more stable contact surface. Now, that's just talking about the brace. What about the manual of arms? Well, if my choices are between something with more AR style manual of arms or this, I'm going to pick something with a more AR style of manual of arms. Not just because I'm very experienced with that layout, that method of being able to operate around the system, but because this is complicated, more so even than an AK, which is going to require more time out of the range training with it. It's going to require a lot more hours spent getting familiarized, as opposed to the vast majority of professionals in this day and age are experienced with AR style weapon systems. So an AR-9 or something along those lines would be far more advantageous to your average user. And then, if those 2 points aren't enough for you, I am not a big fan of handgun cartridges in 3 points of contact type configurations. If I had to pick between this and a 300 blackout, I'm going to pick a 300 blackout pretty much every time, because I have a rifle cartridge at that point. Even at the same size of this, I'm getting so much more work out of a 300 blackout than I am a 9mm. And when you consider that this magazine's not even interchangeable with my handgun, I don't have a lot of advantages that drive me towards utilizing this if I don't have to. Why fight with a handgun cartridge when I can fight with a rifle cartridge and get more work done? Now, you run into certain situations where perhaps over-penetration or over-travel of the round could be of greater concern. So perhaps the 9mm makes more sense in those very specific circumstances, but that is very niche. And I would still sooner have a rifle cartridge for the greater ballistic advantage and really try to control my fighting area as best I can to not wind up shooting people I'm not supposed to be shooting. Because, I picked a short-range cartridge, so I don't have to worry about the potential effect of killing someone I didn't intend to. But you still got to worry about that. That doesn't just go away because you picked a handgun cartridge. They still travel pretty far, and they'll still punch through a variety of barriers if given the opportunity. Now, one thing that I will say, that if I'm going to go with a handgun cartridge in this type of setup, at the very least, I have more barrel than what I would have at the handgun, which gives me more velocity, more energy, all that kind of stuff. So that is a good trade-off if I'm looking to do this. When you see a lot of the 4-inch type setups, those have a very niche requirement, like backpack type setups, which, well, segueing into our next portion, would I recommend this for self-defense type use? This is a tad too large for the vast majority of common backpacks, things that people would actually carry on the day-to-day. This is getting into hiking backpack type size. Now, in a self-defense type role, in home defense, I feel like this has a fantastic place. This makes a lot of sense to me on the home defense type front. You got your light set up. You've got a handgun cartridge, lower probability of over-penetration, not non-existent, just lower probability, and less likely that you're actually going to have to do a lot of mag changes and all that kind of stuff in your average home defense type scenario. Still important that you train around this manual of arms, though, so don't think that that's some sort of excuse to not have to do so. As a truck gun, this is not the best option ever, but I can think of worse options, especially for its size and all that kind of stuff. This isn't bad, it's just not perfect. I can understand someone pressing it into service in that manner. We just always come back to the training type aspect and the inferior pistol caliber, but I think I've beaten that dead horse enough as it is. What about as a competition gun? Absolutely not. You will get wrecked in any PCC competition if you try to run one of these. Now, if you're just going out there in order to improve yourself for the uses that were previously listed, self-defense, professional use, and all that kind of stuff, absolutely take this to a competition. You can take whatever you want to a competition under that umbrella. But if you're actually talking about trying to win, would not recommend. 10 out of 10, would not recommend. Now, what about resisting a terrorist takeover of Nakatomi Towers? Absolutely. This is a number one choice in that particular instance. All right, there's your obligatory Die Hard reference. Let's go ahead and get into whether or not I would buy this. The answer is yes, but maybe not for the reasons that you would necessarily think initially. So I would buy this because I have a long-time love affair with the MP5 for all of the reasons that I think all of us do. Video games, movies, TV shows. This has so much cool factor to it for its representation in a wide variety of media platforms. You can't possibly turn down the fact that this is iconic. And because of that, it has an obligatory place in my collection for being iconic. All right, so with that being the case, how would I set it up? And what would I use it for? First off, let's go ahead and get into setup. So we can see here, we do not presently have an optic. I would absolutely mount an optic on one of these. Just optics have a definite use. There's a utility involved with optics. Now this rear sight, I do not care for the aperture style sights. On the widest aperture, the front sight is framed beautifully. However, as you go to the smaller apertures, you wind up with more and more of a funnel effect, like looking down a hallway, where you kind of lose some of your situational awareness around the sights. I'm not a big fan of that. But HK does produce what are referred to as castle sights, which has 4 different sized V notches cut into it, kind of like pistol sights. So that would be a little bit more open field of view that would allow me to quickly acquire this front sight while also still gaining more situational awareness and not necessarily feel like I'm looking down a straw whenever it is that I'm lining up on a target. And that's what really makes me interested here. Now, I would also probably SBR it, purely because of my own interests. Like, yeah, it's cool as a pistol type setup, and especially if laws weren't changing, it would be more applicable to me in a pistol type setup because I already have an SBR as a truck gun. So having something that was maybe a little bit more state border blind that I could more readily travel with would be better. But we come back to the manual of arms type portion of this and the fact that this is not necessarily a hard use weapon system for me as much as it's something that carries nostalgia and that I do want to kind of train around, that training strange that I've talked about way long ago when I first reviewed the SIG P226 double action Kellerman. Something that has a very different manual of arms that's going to make me think about what it is that I'm doing. That's going to really drive home the idea of working efficiently. And in terms of efficiency, I would also put on an ambidextrous selector on here so I could ride that on this side of the gun and not be stuck with the left side mounted safety selector. So I think that pretty much covers how I would configure it and my purposes for it. And with that, honestly, guys, that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
Like midway down the base. Yeah.